Upon my birth in 1964, I was registered colored, a label I was to spend my entire life despising. From the 1950s, the Influx Control Act introduced extreme forms of anti-African xenophobia. This act meant that everyone belonging to and associated with an African tribe belonged outside European cities. To be Khoi means to be human. People through people. Persons from people. Persons for people. What that basically means is that all humans are equal and that no one person can ever dominate another. My family was forcibly removed several times around District 6 Cape Town, where I spent my childhood, before being moved to a place 32 kilometers away. District 6 became known as a colored area after the forced removals of native Africans in 1901, 1936, and 1950s. The colored inhabitants grew for a few decades until they too were removed in 1970s. There is a pervasive narrative that the Khoi and San became extinct due to the deadly European diseases such as smallpox of 1713 and 1755. Although indigenous people were hard hit by smallpox in 1713, it was the earlier and the later resistance wars starting in 1659 which pushed my people into the northern and southeastern territories. European impressions and illustrations portray us as a particularly ugly race of people, especially the women. The value placed on Eurocentric features is one of the most traumatic repercussions of European colonization and an effective instrument of violence against indigenous people, particularly dehumanizing, with the images of genitals of women. The curiosity about how a low evolutionary status and sexual depravity of an inferior race resulted in the sanctification of the black body. It is difficult to challenge stereotypes when the average person is unlikely to interact with or even recognize an indigenous person. Our cultures remain imagined and portrayed as if we are traditional hunter-gatherers from the Stone Age. Genocide trauma is well known, but extinction creates extreme difficulty in telling one's story, especially when one's land is still occupied. Being extinct describes animals, plants, and human beings who were killed off, leaving no living representatives. The book published by Portuguese Gomes de Zurara in the 1450s first invented blackness as inferior and beastly to justify their already established plunder and capture of Africans. Romanus Pontifex, issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, and Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, officially established Christian domination and encouraged the conquest and colonization and exploitation of all non-Christians. Europeans inherited a system of classifications from their medieval ancestors called the Society of Orders. In the 1500s and 1600s, almost 90% of Europeans were poor and living on farms and small rural communities governed by this Society of Orders. The Dutch and English were frustrated by Portuguese and Spanish dominance of the seas. In 1602, the Dutch East India Trading Company, the VOC, known by South Africans as the Heren 17, a conglomerate of traders and independent Dutch companies, was formed. It was only in 1649, praising the fertility of the land and the health of the livestock, and the friendliness of the locals that an instruction called remonstrantie was given by the Dutch government to establish a refreshment station at the Cape. This saw the beginning of the golden age for the Dutch, but started a 369-year, 6 months and 3-week period of untold misery and trauma for indigenous people. The first recorded act of violence involving the Khoi was in 1510. It was reported by the men of one of the most feared military commanders, Portuguese Viceroy Francisco de Almeida. The men returned home and found Europeans looting, ransacking, abducting girl children and stealing cattle from their kraal on what is now called Devil's Peak, a part of the majestic Table Mountain. Only one arrow was fired, and 65 armed men, including the Viceroy, died at that battle called the Battle of Attaqua, when they were stampeded by Khoi cattle. This discouraged the Portuguese from occupying our land, and they instead took a wide berth for 100 years around the Cape. Then, in 1647, a Dutch ship hit the rocks at Mully Point with 250 men. They were completely dependent on the Khoi's hospitality. They stayed for a year until 1648. During their stay, they started building a stone structure. It was on their return to Holland that they reported the favorable conditions of the Cape. Hottentot, bushman, vagabond, bosjesman, singers, strandlopers. These terms for indigenous people exist on official documents. Stereotype as immune to civilization. We were characterized as disposable and unsuitable and too savage for settler needs. In 1709, pass laws were introduced to all non-Europeans. Khoi and son were identified by the names of their owners. The Tilbach Code of 1753 ushered in more restrictions. In 1770, indigenous people were declared vermin, pests, and vagabonds. In 1777, the Dutch Uren 17 instructed settlers, quote, to attack the robbers from all sides in their dens and lurking places, and to reduce them either to a permanent state of peace and quiet, or otherwise, in case of necessity, entirely destroy them, unquote. In 1797, these laws were further tightened. While these laws were abolished for foreign enslaved people in 1834, they were not abolished for my people. When the British took over the Cape in 1807, after the abolition of the slave trade, the Europeans still didn't know the difference between the Khoi and the South. They officially homogenized our people with the Hottentot Code. A provision to that law, the Apprenticeship of Servants Act of 1812, decreed that children be apprenticed for a further 10 years. Various vagrancy laws were already in place when the Hottentot Code was repealed in 1828. This was followed by the Masters and Servants Act of 1867 and a compulsory lashing law in 1894. The Cape Colonials were quick to ensure that all Europeans who in their home countries were split by political and social boundaries like religion, class, ethnicity, and gender were viewed as rulers. Material culture therefore played a big role in establishing the European status and identity. Clothing was used to distinguish subordinated people. In Europe at the time, food played a significant role. Some of the elite believed that their class entitled them to eat only from foods high from the filth of the ground, and that roots and bulbs were slave foods. In all indigenous cultures, food and medicines are interwoven. They found our food substandard. Only European foods could maintain their superior position. Growing imported foods acted as biological weapons, destroying indigenous foods and starving people and animals. Ironically, the first apartheid war built by Jan van Riebeeck, the invader in 1660, to cut the Cape Colony off the rest of Africa, was made of wild almond, a significant part of the indigenous diet. As in the European Bible, indigenous teachings describe how water, wind, plants, and animals were created first, while humans were created later. While the European God gives humans superiority over the rest of creations and instructs them to tame and rule over the earth and its creations, the creator of indigenous people gives us no such power. In indigenous stories, the creator instructs plants and animals to take pity and care for the younger and weaker siblings, the humans, and teach them to live harmoniously. In indigenous cultures, nature is not dead or passive. Animals like elephants, antelope, lions, cats, zebra, birds, insects, and plants have their own purpose and power. All indigenous people in the world use totems as symbols of kinship. It is one of the oldest, most sustainable environmental conservation tools. They reflect relationships of trust, wisdom, respect, and understanding. In Africa, these totems gave rise to stigmatization, name-calling, abuse, and comparisons to animals. Capitalist ventures such as mining are therefore sacrilege and the destruction of us all. The arrival of European women was the destruction of families and households. Indigenous women were forced into domestic servitude roles as wet nurses, nannies, and taught to cook European cuisine. European women were to set the example of how civilized women behave, and much of what was defined as civilized was what happened in the kitchen. When patriarchy arrived in the Cape, it imposed on matriarchs private marriages, forcing them into contractual reproductive servitude, tending to their husbands